It was a grey Thursday in Milwaukee, one of those mornings when the sky seems to press down a little heavier than usual. The city felt colder than it should have been for late March, and the wind carried with it the strange stillness of unfinished things. At the Bucks training facility, Giannis Antetokounmpo arrived before the staff, before the lights were fully on, before the warmth of motion could chase away the chill of the day. He wasn't there for an early workout or a tactical session. He wasn't sure why he was there at all. Something in him felt unsettled. He sat alone in the quiet gym, the sound of his breath echoing faintly off the hardwood. The weight of expectation, both public and personal, had begun to feel heavier in recent weeks. Injuries plagued the roster. Losses mounted at the wrong time of the season, and more than that, something inside him had begun to whisper a question he didn't yet want to answer. What happens after all this? After the points, the wins, the noise? That morning, while he laced his shoes, though not to play, a woman walked through the side door of the facility. She moved slowly, carefully, as if every step were measured not just by pain, but by memory. Her coat was long and tan, old but well kept. In her hands, she clutched a simple leather-bound notebook. It took Giannis a moment to recognize her. The face was familiar but older now, fragile but dignified. "Mrs. Moore?" he asked, rising instinctively. She smiled, though there was something haunted in her eyes. "You still remember me?" she said softly. "How could I not?" Giannis replied, moving forward to greet her. Evelyn Moore had once been a warm, welcoming presence during a time of uncertainty in his life. The wife of Calvin Moore, a respected but understated coach who had spent decades shaping young athletes, mostly at the collegiate level. Calvin wasn't flashy, he wasn't famous, but for a brief defining period, he had been a quiet force in Giannis's transition to the NBA, a mentor whose presence lingered long after their paths had formally parted. Giannis remembered the last time he'd seen Coach Moore, backstage at a draft event, the older man resting a hand on his shoulder and saying simply, "Don't confuse humility with doubt. The world will try to do that for you." Coach Moore had died 5 years ago. The news had reached Giannis while he was on a road trip, and he remembered pausing in a hotel room hallway, stunned by the hollow ache of it. He hadn't made it to the funeral. That had stayed with him. Evelyn extended the notebook toward him now. "This belonged to Calvin," she said. "He kept it close to him even in the hospital. I wasn't sure who it was for, not at first, but in the last few weeks before he passed, he talked about you often, told me things he never wrote down." Giannis took the notebook carefully, almost reverently. The leather was worn, the pages yellowed slightly at the edges. It smelled faintly of cedar and ink. He looked at her, confused. "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because I waited," she said simply. "Because I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do, and because lately I've been feeling my own time growing shorter. Sometimes you hold on to something too long and it turns into regret." She looked at him with a strange mix of affection and urgency. "There's something in there he never told you, something I think he meant to, something he wrote but didn't send. I thought you should see it. And if I'm being honest, I need to let it go." Giannis hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," he managed. Evelyn nodded, her eyes already misting. "Don't thank me yet. Just read it. When you're ready." She turned to leave. Giannis offered to walk her out, but she declined with a wave of the hand. "I've said what I came to say." He stood there for a long moment, the notebook in his hands, watching the door close behind her. Something in his chest felt strange, not tight exactly, but expanded, stretched in an unfamiliar way. That night, alone in his apartment, he sat by the window and turned the first page. At first, it was what he expected: notes on coaching philosophies, sketches of plays, reflections on games from years past. Calvin Moore had always been a student of the game, and the notebook was a living archive of his mind. There were quotes from ancient philosophers alongside observations about free-throw mechanics. There were stories about players, some names Giannis recognized, others he didn't. But then, deeper into the pages, things shifted. The tone grew more personal, more introspective. The entries weren't dated, but it was clear they were written in the later years. One page was marked with a folded corner, the paper slightly more worn from being opened and closed, again and again. Giannis turned to it. His breath caught. There, in Calvin's steady handwriting, was a letter, unsent, addressed not with a name but with a phrase. "To the boy I once watched play like he was trying to outrun gravity," Giannis read. Slowly, carefully. The letter began with a memory, a cold gym in Athens, the echo of a ball on concrete, the way a tall, awkward teenager moved with the kind of hunger that couldn't be coached. Calvin hadn't spoken to him that day. He'd watched from a distance, having come on a last-minute trip, tipped off by someone who owed him a favor. "I saw in you a kind of quiet fire I'd only seen once before," the letter read, "and I realized later I wasn't just watching a player. I was watching a possibility." The letter went on to explain that Calvin had made calls, quiet, unofficial ones, that nudged Giannis's name into rooms it hadn't yet reached. He never told anyone, not even Evelyn, until much later. It wasn't about taking credit. It was about preserving something sacred, the purity of belief. But what struck Giannis most wasn't the revelation, it was the next part. "I knew you'd become great," Calvin had written, "but what I didn't know, what I hoped, was whether you'd remain good. Not kind of good, not brand good. I mean good in the sense that you would carry the weight of others when it became easier to let them fall. That you would remember that your gift was never meant to serve only you." The words hit deeper than any headline, any trophy. They felt like a mirror being held up to his soul. As the letter closed, Calvin confessed he had meant to give the notebook to Giannis years ago, but feared it would be too much, that it would add pressure where there should be lightness. "You don't owe the world a performance," it read. "You owe it presence, real presence, the kind that can't be faked." Giannis closed the notebook slowly, his thumb tracing the edges of the cover. Outside, the Milwaukee night was still and silent. Inside, something had shifted. The old questions remained, but now they felt less like burdens and more like invitations. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He just sat with the weight of the words, the memory of a man who had seen something in him before the world did, and a woman who had waited until her heart told her it was finally time to pass the torch. Tomorrow would come soon, but tonight, Giannis let the silence answer for him. The night after receiving the notebook, Giannis barely slept. There was something strange about the silence that filled his apartment, as though the air itself had shifted weight, carrying memories he hadn't asked to revisit. He left the notebook closed on the table, its presence alone louder than the late-night news murmuring from the muted TV in the background. Something inside him, maybe instinct, maybe fear, told him that once he truly opened those pages, something in him would be rearranged. And that kind of change didn't come without a price. The next morning, after a short practice session and a quiet nod to his teammates, Giannis returned home and sat in the corner of the room by the window. The sun barely filtered through the gray of a late Milwaukee sky. He reached for the notebook, opened it again, and picked up where he'd left off. As the pages turned, Coach Calvin Moore's voice unfolded like a ghost beside him, steady, patient, without any hint of spectacle. The notebook was filled with moments that felt oddly intimate. Not secrets exactly, but reflections too vulnerable for a team meeting or a post-game speech. He wrote about losses that had nothing to do with basketball, a miscarriage his wife had suffered in their early years, a friend who'd battled depression silently until it was too late, the gnawing shame of having once turned down a coaching offer because it came from a school that didn't look right, a mistake Moore called the moment I realized I was still learning how to be the man I believed I was. For Giannis, reading these pages was like watching someone undress their soul. Coach Moore wasn't offering answers. He was offering his humanity, cracked and honest and unfiltered. And there, amid the ink and the margin scribbles, Giannis found something he hadn't expected, the coach's unfinished letter to his deceased son, Daniel. It began plainly, like everything else Moore had written. "If you'd lived long enough," he wrote, "I wonder what kind of man you'd be now. I see bits of you in the kids I coach, especially in the quiet ones, the ones who don't believe they're allowed to want too much. There was one, in particular, a boy I watched once, all arms and legs, eyes like they were searching for permission to belong. His name was Giannis. The moment Giannis read that, a wave surged through his chest. He stopped, set the book down, and stared ahead at nothing in particular. For a moment, he didn't know whether to keep reading. Was this even meant for him? Was he trespassing inside a grief he had no right to touch? But he did keep reading. He had to. Moore described watching that skinny Greek kid with a nervous smile and a storm behind his eyes. He wrote about the first time he saw Giannis sprint the length of a concrete court in Athens, moving like the game was chasing him, or maybe like he was trying to chase something else: stability, belonging, identity. Moore confessed he'd never seen raw movement so hungry, and yet so controlled. He ran like he'd been carrying weight his whole life, the page read. But what I couldn't figure out was whether he was running from something or toward it. That sentence stayed with Giannis. It echoed, because he hadn't known either. Further into the notebook, Moore detailed how he'd arranged almost covertly for an NBA scout to travel to Greece. He hadn't told the boy. He hadn't even told the scout what he was truly doing, just handed him a plane ticket and said, "Go watch this kid. Don't talk to him, just watch." Giannis felt something tighten in his chest. All these years he'd believed that his break had come from some miraculous alignment of fate and perseverance, that he'd been discovered because he showed up, worked hard, and played without expectations. But now he understood. There had been a hand behind the curtain. Someone had placed a quiet bet on his life and never asked for recognition. That kind of belief is rare, sacred, and it made him question everything about what he thought he'd earned. There was one moment in particular that split him wide open. It came in another letter, written not to Giannis but about him. Moore had labeled it Notes on 34. The number was a reference, of course, Giannis's jersey, the identity he'd forged in Milwaukee. But what Moore wrote wasn't about stats or style. It was about character. 34 reminds me, Moore wrote, that greatness has nothing to do with noise. He doesn't seek the spotlight, yet it follows him. What I fear is that the machine of sport will eventually devour him, make him believe that branding is legacy, that trophies define worth. I hope someone teaches him otherwise before it's too late. The vulnerability in that hope, the quiet terror in those words, shattered something in Giannis. For years he had carried the weight of his own myth, the immigrant kid, the humble star, the reluctant king. But now all of that felt thin, performative, compared to this question: what was he really doing with the belief someone had placed in him? That night Giannis didn't train, didn't stretch, didn't even shower for a while. He sat in the dark, reading that page over and over again. And then, slowly, he pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. Not for anyone else, for himself. The words didn't come easily at first, but once they started, they poured out. "I am not a brand," he wrote. "I am not an MVP. I am not even a champion. I am the product of a moment someone else gave me, and I haven't said thank you in a language worthy of it." He folded the letter and slipped it into the notebook. The next few days were a blur. Games came and went. Interviews passed in rote phrases. But internally, Giannis was building something invisible, a bridge between who he'd been and who he might still become. He started asking different questions in team meetings. Instead of, "What's the play?" he asked, "What's the cost if we don't do this right?" Instead of, "Who's scoring?" he asked, "Who's being heard?" In film reviews, he stayed after the coaches left and spoke to the younger players one-on-one. Not about technique, about fear, about focus, about home. And yet, he still hadn't gone back to see Evelyn Moore. He didn't know why. Maybe part of him feared what else she might tell him. Maybe part of him wasn't ready to admit aloud how much Coach Moore had shaped him, or how close he'd come to letting that influence die in silence. But fate, as it often does, pushed him anyway. After a tough loss on the road, one where Giannis had played well but not well enough, he sat alone in the locker room long after everyone else had left. He was holding the notebook, flipping through it not for answers but for grounding. That's when he saw a final note, one he hadn't noticed before, scribbled on the inside of the back cover. It wasn't profound, it was simple. "What will you carry forward?" The question stung, not because he didn't know the answer, but because now he finally did. Coach Moore hadn't needed Giannis to win titles. He hadn't even needed him to succeed. What he'd needed was for Giannis to recognize that greatness is a relay, not a destination, that someone had handed him the baton, and now it was his turn to pass it on. That night, Giannis made the call. He told Evelyn Moore he was coming over, that he had something to say and that maybe finally he was ready to say it. She didn't speak for a few seconds, then gently, "I've been waiting." The first thing Giannis noticed when he returned to Evelyn Moore's house was how quiet it was. Not the kind of silence that waits to be broken, but the kind that had grown roots. The furniture was exactly as he remembered, the same threadbare cushions and faded family portraits, the scent of lavender and dust. It was the kind of home that had nothing left to prove. Evelyn opened the door slowly, her face thinner than before, but her expression calm. She didn't greet him with words. She stepped aside and let him in, as though this visit had been expected long before he ever made the decision to come. They sat in the living room again, no small talk, no pleasantries. Giannis held a letter in his hands, a reply of sorts, to everything she and Coach Moore had given him. But he didn't hand it over right away. Instead, he studied her, the way she folded her hands in her lap, the slight tremble in her shoulders, the weathered strength that still clung to her posture. She looked like someone who had carried many stories too long, someone who had finally found the last person worthy of hearing the ending. "I've read it all," Giannis said quietly. "Every page, every note, every line he wrote to me, and the ones he didn't." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Then you know," she said. "You know why he never told you." He looked down at the letter in his lap. "He didn't want to distract me or weigh me down." "No," she said softly. "He didn't want to claim you." That hit deeper than he expected, not because it surprised him, but because it explained everything. For years, Giannis had believed his path was entirely his own, forged from struggle, talent, and sheer will. Now he understood the quiet network of choices behind him, the unseen scaffolding of belief that had allowed him to rise. Moore had helped shape him, yes, but he had never reached out to take credit. That restraint was its own kind of love. Giannis took a breath. "I wrote something," he said, holding up the folded letter. "It's not perfect, but it's real." "Read it to me," she said. He unfolded the page and began. His voice, usually calm and composed in interviews, cracked just slightly as he spoke. "Dear Evelyn," he began, "I want to thank you not just for the notebook and not just for waiting to give it to me. I want to thank you for carrying it until I was someone who could carry it further." He paused, just long enough for the words to land. "Coach Moore didn't just believe in who I was. He believed in who I could become. And now I understand something I never did before. Belief is not a gift, it's a debt, and I've spent a long time pretending I didn't owe anyone anything. That stops now." Evelyn's eyes didn't leave him. "I've decided to start a foundation," he continued. "Not in my name, in his, the Moore Foundation. It's going to support kids like me, kids who don't have connections or gear, or a last name that opens doors. Kids who are raw and rough and scared, but who move like the game lives inside them. We'll help them with training, education, mentorship, and not just basketball. Life." Evelyn blinked slowly. "He would have liked that," she said. "I hope so," Giannis said, "because it's more than honoring him. It's about continuing what he started, quietly, without cameras, without applause." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The letter sat on the table between them, and it felt like a contract had been signed, not with ink, but with understanding. Then Evelyn reached across, took his hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You're the best part of him that lived beyond him," she whispered. It was not something Giannis could respond to. He just bowed his head, and in the silence that followed, something heavy lifted. The next few weeks were unlike anything Giannis had experienced in his career. Not because he was scoring more, as in fact he wasn't. Not because the Bucks went on a winning streak and they didn't. What changed was how he moved. He didn't walk into practice anymore to lead. He walked in to listen. He sought out players who sat quietly in the corners of the room, who didn't speak unless asked. He sat with the 13th man on the bench during film sessions. He stopped correcting and started asking questions. "Where's your mind right now? What are you afraid to say out loud? What do you need that you don't think you deserve?" These weren't things he would have thought to ask a year ago, maybe not even a month ago, but now they came naturally. Like he was channeling a voice bigger than his own, the Moore Foundation launched quietly. No press conference, no campaign, just a digital page, a mission statement, and a single handwritten note scanned in as its first image. A quote from Moore's notebook: "You don't find leaders, you build them by believing in who they already are." The impact was immediate. Word spread. Within weeks, trainers and teachers and former athletes were reaching out to volunteer. Within months, 2 camps were established, one in Greece, one in Milwaukee. Giannis visited both, not as a guest of honor, as a worker. He passed out water bottles. He rebounded for drills. He gave long, honest talks in small circles. And when one teenage boy in Athens missed a free throw and dropped his head in shame, Giannis walked over, lifted the kid's chin and said, "Missing shots isn't failure, giving up is." The boy didn't say anything. But later, a coach overheard him telling a friend, "Giannis told me I don't have to be perfect, just present." That phrase stuck, just present. It became the unofficial motto of the foundation. Back in Milwaukee, something else began to shift. Giannis's teammates started showing up differently, not because of any mandate, because they were watching. When your leader listens, you start listening. When your leader forgives himself, you start forgiving others. When your leader walks into the room like the purpose is bigger than the scoreboard, you start asking why you play at all. It wasn't long before the media noticed. Not the story about the foundation. That came later. What they noticed was the change in tone. "You've been different lately," one reporter said after a game. "More focused." Giannis smiled. "Focused on the right things." "Which are?" He didn't hesitate. "Making sure that when I leave this game, I don't take everything with me. Some things have to stay behind. Some things have to keep moving without me." The final day, Evelyn Moore saw Giannis was a warm spring afternoon. She wasn't well, her health had declined and she'd stopped answering most calls. But when he arrived, she had on her favorite shawl and her husband's old watch. He brought her flowers. She asked him to read one more thing to her. He opened the notebook again, now worn from use, and read the final passage aloud, the one Moore had written long before any of this happened. "Legacy is not a name etched in stone. It's a hand extended when no one else is looking." When he finished, Evelyn closed her eyes. "He believed in you," she said, "but more than that, he hoped for you. And hope is harder to hold than belief." That night, Giannis didn't sleep. He sat on his balcony, notebook in hand, and wrote something of his own. Not for the public, not for his kids. For the next young athlete he'd never meet, the one who didn't know someone was already believing in them from far away. He folded it, placed it in the back of the notebook and whispered to the air, "Your turn."